Matthew the tax collector, a biblical portrait. Among the 12 men chosen by Jesus to be his apostles, one stands out for his profession and the radical nature of his calling: Matthew, the tax collector. Also known as Levi, the son of Alphaeus. Mark 2:14. Matthew's story is a testament to the transformative power of grace, the inclusive reach of the gospel, and the surprising nature of those whom God calls to carry his message. Though not as frequently mentioned as some of the other apostles, Matthew's life and legacy remain profound, primarily through the gospel that bears his name. Matthew is first introduced in the gospel accounts in a brief but dramatic scene. Sitting at the tax booth, engaged in the work of collecting tolls and tariffs, likely from fellow Jews, he is approached by Jesus, who simply says, "Follow me." Without hesitation, Matthew rises and follows him. Matthew 9:9, Mark 2:14, Luke 5:27-28. The brevity of this moment belies its significance. Tax collectors were among the most despised individuals in Jewish society. Seen as collaborators with the Roman occupiers and often associated with greed and corruption, they were viewed as both religious and political traitors. That Jesus would call such a man into his inner circle was shocking, even scandalous. Matthew's immediate response, leaving behind his post and livelihood, speaks to the compelling power of Jesus' call. There is no recorded argument, no delay, and no conditions. His obedience is complete and immediate. In Luke's account, it is emphasized that he left everything. Luke 5:28, a phrase that mirrors the radical discipleship expected of all who would follow Christ. Soon after his call, Matthew hosted a banquet in his home, inviting many of his fellow tax collectors and others described as sinners to dine with Jesus and his disciples. Matthew 9:10, Luke 5:29. This gathering, which scandalized the Pharisees, served as a living parable of the mission of Christ. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Mark 2:17. Matthew, once a social and religious outcast, became a bridge between Jesus and the very people society had rejected. His past did not disqualify him. It became the backdrop against which the mercy of Christ shone more brightly. Though Matthew's name does not feature prominently in the rest of the gospel narratives, his presence among the 12 is affirmed in every list of the apostles, e.g. Matthew 10:3, Mark 3:18, Luke 6:15, Acts 1:13. This continued inclusion is a silent testimony to the grace that called him and the faithfulness with which he responded. Tradition holds that he faithfully carried the message of Christ after the resurrection, and according to early church sources, he ministered among his own people before possibly traveling abroad to proclaim the gospel. Yet perhaps the most lasting contribution of Matthew is the gospel that bears his name. While the gospel does not explicitly claim authorship, early church tradition from as early as the 2nd century credits Matthew the Apostle with its composition. Written primarily for a Jewish audience, the Gospel of Matthew is rich with references to Old Testament prophecy, presenting Jesus as the promised Messiah and rightful King. It contains some of the most detailed teachings of Jesus, including the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5-7, the parables of the kingdom and the Great Commission, Matthew 28:18-20. Matthew's Gospel reflects a deep understanding of Scripture, a careful organizational structure, and a pastoral concern for helping Jewish believers see how Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets. For a former tax collector, someone once excluded from the religious community, to write such a theologically rich and spiritually insightful account is a remarkable testimony to the transforming work of God. His portrayal of Jesus is both majestic and compassionate. Jesus is presented as the new Moses, the rightful heir to David's throne, the teacher greater than the scribes, and yet the one who eats with sinners, heals the broken, and lays down his life for the world. It is perhaps no coincidence that someone who had once been marginalized would be especially attentive to Jesus, concerned for the outcasts, the poor in spirit, and the least of these. Matthew 25:40. Matthew's story is ultimately one of redemption and purpose. His past did not define him. Grace did. In being called by Christ, he was not merely rescued from a disreputable profession. He was entrusted with a divine commission. His inclusion among the apostles reminds the church that no one is beyond the reach of Christ's call, and his authorship of the gospel affirms that God can use even those the world despises to proclaim his truth with clarity and authority. Though the Bible gives us only glimpses of Matthew's life, those glimpses are rich in meaning. He was a man who left behind the comforts of wealth and the isolation of compromise to follow the Messiah into a life of discipleship. He was a host who invited the broken to meet the healer, and he was a witness who, through his gospel, continues to proclaim that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God.